Representative Elliott.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So I rise in opposition to this budget because it is antithetical to everything that I believe in. If we talk about the problem of the tax structure in Connecticut, let's look at the facts of the tax structure in Connecticut. DRS put a report out about 2 years ago looking at how the different income quintiles pay into the system, looking at both state and local local taxes. And what you look and find when you see this is that for earners who make $75,000 or less, they are paying at minimum 14% of their income to state and local taxes. And for those earners who make $165,000 or more, they pay no more than 8%. A lot of talk has been bandied about in terms of the people who are leaving the state. If you look over the past 6 years at the tax filers in Connecticut, what you'll see is the diminution of filers who make $50,000 or less, and you will see accrual of earners who make $100,000 or more. But the narrative we all have in our collective minds is that the wealthy are leaving our state because it is simply too expensive due to the tax burden of living here. And so anytime there's a person who is wealthy who leaves a state, we all point to that person and say, look, see, this is the problem with Connecticut. And we take this anecdotal evidence and paint broad strokes across the board and say this is the problem. And then we ignore the facts that we are the wealthiest state per capita in the US. We ignore the fact that over the last 10 years, through 2 tax increases, we've gone from 4th most to 2nd most, and now we're tied for 1st in terms of millionaires per capita. We ignore the fact that the top income tax earners, in those 2 largest tax increases in our state's history, and I say that tongue-in-cheek, because the top tax income bracket went from 6.5 to 6.7%, and then 6.7% to 6.99%. So in aggregate, less than 0.5% on our top income earners making $500,000 or more. And if you look between the 1940s to 1970s at the federal level and see that the top marginal tax rate was between 70 to 94%, and you can see that right now we're arguing over literally 0.2, 0.3% on what our wealthy can pay into the system. And then we put out a budget that slashes EITC, going from 27.5% to 23%. Now, it's certainly better than slashing it entirely, but this is a program that gives money back to people who need that to live, who are working 40, 60, 80 hours a week. We're slashing energy efficiency funds, green bank funds, RGGI funds, investments in the future and health of our state and our environment. And when you look at what has happened to the wealthy in our state and across the country, but our state specifically, because we are very much indicative of what is happening more broadly, in the past 30 years, the top 1% of income earners in Connecticut have gained 84% of all income gains accessible, meaning that for all the new revenue that is made within the private markets, it's all going to those who already own the capital, thereby cementing their place in that top quintile, making it nearly impossible for those who are lower to get their way up. And we have this dream, this American ideal, that anybody can work their way up, but we have tax policies that make it nearly impossible to do so. Because what happens is, at a certain point, you outrun the cost of living. And when you outrun the cost of living and you're making millions of dollars a year, you take that money and you invest it. And when you do that, you keep on outrunning and outrunning and outrunning the various costs. And you store it away, and you accrue and you accrue and you accrue. And you get more of a stranglehold on the political process, thereby making issues of our unbalanced tax structure even more unbalanced and making it even harder going into the future to make these fixes. So when I get up and I say that the top 1% needs to be taxed more, the opposite side can say, but look at how much they're taxed already. They're giving 30% of the overall revenue going toward the state. How much should they be putting in? Well, here's the problem. If we don't address this problem now, And in 5 years, instead of 30% of the overall revenue coming from the top 1% of earners, it's 35%. And then in 5 more years, maybe it's 40%, then 45%. Then the argument of not being able to tax our wealthy becomes stronger over time and self-perpetuates. Until the people who are making $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a year are looking up and seeing these incredible amounts of money that's just flowing upward because we have no way of balancing the scales. Capitalism isn't a natural phenomenon. We've created capitalism, and by and large, it's a good for the common man. And the reason is it takes our natural tendencies to be greedy and to hoard, and it turns us into entrepreneurs. And it turns us into heads of companies, where we are using the methodologies of accruing more money as a way to invest and create new jobs and invest in research and development and create new technologies. And that's great, and that's wonderful. But to ignore the downsides and aftermath effects and various parts of like economic inefficiencies would be to basically say that it's okay for the power brokers and for the ultra wealthy to maintain their class status indefinitely. And part of the reason we became the country that we are is because we understood that the investments that we make now are what we attain later for the rest of humanity. Now, as a millennial, I can tell you that my peers by and large are walking out of universities tens and tens of thousands of dollars in debt. And for decades, through the GI Bill, through various subsidies, it was possible to walk away with a college degree with no debt by working a part-time job. And now, we're at a point in time where for maybe 20 years out from graduating, you may still have debt, never actually being able to put away for the future and safety of your own retirement, or being able to take care of your children for the generation ahead of you. So what we're doing right now is we're being very short-sighted in terms of what we're doing for the structure of taxation in Connecticut. And that is ultimately my concern, is that every year we come back to this budget cycle, we are thinking, how do we solve the problem now, as opposed to how do we solve the problem of the future? How do we ensure that we're making the investments so that we can grow the economy, just as my colleagues on both sides of the aisle say? Now, if we didn't have transportation and our federal highway system, and we didn't ask our ultra wealthy to pay into the system to ensure that we could have the structure of whether it's investing in the internet, in vaccination, whatever the common good may be, then we wouldn't be here today. And there's nobody crying tears for the wealthy of the past who paid more into the system to ensure that it was more stable for the future. So ultimately for me, the reason I stand in opposition is that I think this is a budget that ultimately asks of everybody but those who can afford it most. It punishes the poor for being poor. It punishes the middle class for living in a society that does not protect them, and it rewards those who already have it made by either growing up white, growing up rich, or growing up in a state that protects only those who are in the top quintile, or in some cases the top 1% of income earners. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I will close my remarks.